After we create a data source definition, our next step in the report development process is to create a dataset. In simple terms, a dataset is the query used to get data for the report. But it also includes a description of the fields or table columns to retrieve from the data source. This collection of fields provides placeholders for data in your report. You can type the query string directly into a generic query designer as shown here, but for some connection types, such as Microsoft SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server Analysis Services, you can use a graphical query designer to help you build the dataset query and define parameters. The graphical query designer displays by default when you add a query to the dataset, unless the data source connection type doesn't support a query designer. In that case, a generic designer displays, which simply allows you to type in your query string. If you have a query saved to a file already, or if you have another report that has the same query that you want to use in your current dataset, you can use the Import button in the Query Designer. Whether you use the generic or graphical query designer, you can execute the query to confirm the query is valid and that you get the results you need. At that point, the fields collection for your data sort is generated to match the data columns that you see in the query results. A dataset also has other properties besides the query and fields. In fact, before you can create the query, you need to specify the data source that you want to use. That way, the report designer knows whether to display a graphical query designer, if there's one available, or to display the generic query designer otherwise. You also need to specify the query type as a property. The default is text, which means you'll supply a query to select data from the source. For some data sources, you can use the table query type option to get all data from a target table. Or you can select the option to use a stored procedure, and then select from a list of available stored procedures in the specific data source. Another important property that you have in the dataset is the Timeout property. By default, it's set to 0, which means the query will wait indefinitely for the data source to return data. If you want to put a time limit on the query and fail the report if the data source is taking too long, you can put in the maximum number of seconds that you want to wait as the timeout value. In addition to the dataset properties, the dataset contains several collections. The most important collection is the one we've already seen, the fields collection. This collection contains one field for every column referenced by the query. But it can also contain calculated fields. You can actually add fields to the collection based on expressions that you define, and you can use the result in your report just like any other field. Another collection in the dataset is the filters collection, which doesn't always exist in every dataset like the fields collection does. I'll explain more about filtering datasets in the parameters module of this course, but for now, suffice it to say that a dataset filter allows you to selectively exclude rows that don't meet a condition that you specify, but this exclusion takes place after the query executes. The third collection in the dataset is the parameters collection. Not every dataset has a parameters collection, but if you create query parameters, then you'll find them here in the dataset. Dataset parameters can work in two ways. First, you can create a query parameter to dynamically modify the where clause of the select statement in your query, and I'll explain more about how to do that in the parameters module. Another way that dataset parameters can work is as an input parameter for a stored procedure. Now, one way that you can create a dataset is to embed it directly into the report definition, or you can configure it as a shared dataset. If you need to use the same query repeatedly with many reports, then a shared dataset is the way to go, much like you can use a shared data source with many reports. Shared datasets are a new feature in SQL Server 2008 R2. When you create a shared dataset, you're actually creating an RSD file that has an XML structure like the one you see here, except that I've eliminated the field elements due to space constraints.